Thank you for coming. On this nice sunny day, maybe one will spend time outside. This might be interesting. uh, I hope you'll excuse the drawings today because they are not very good presented, simply because they are out of age. Since 1987-8, I stopped working on this line of research because I was busy in the book of scissoring right. At that period, technology developed much fast, and most of the drawings were handmade, and they were in slide format, and somehow the slide became unclear. So now when it's transferred to digital, it's not very clear. So I have to excuse the quality of the presentation. The thing? Remote control. For a strange reason, architects are not much interested in designing buildings for change. Although the built environment is constantly changing. What was this building before it becomes a school of architecture? It was something, right? And before that, maybe it was something else. So the built environment is dynamic, it's not static, continuously changing. This is not only for monumental buildings that are built to last, and then they are changed from the inside, but also the everyday environment. If you walk in Stockholm and you see all types of changes, residential buildings transformed into hotels, several buildings are joined together to make an office building, and so on. This is a fact that to some reason the professionals are not dealing with it as we are supposed to. Now, this issue was first realized and brought into the profession by George Bracken, my mentor, my supervisor. I worked 6 years with him. I was lucky enough to teach 5 courses with him. When the housing project failed in the Netherlands, after the First World War, he established a research center called SAR. In that research center, they were wondering why housing keep failing. The answer was simple, is that users are different than designers. The users have different interests, they have different requirements, needs. The family, they get bigger, it's more space. You cannot design 100, 200 apartments the same, because apartment for a doctor is different than a businessman, different than for a student. So there is so many reasons for the built environment to change. But the people cannot change it because they have no control over the built environment. And the built environment, when it's built, especially if it was, let's say, precast housing, it's freezed. It's difficult to adapt to change. I'll give you some example now to show how things change. Here, for example, in Tunis, there was a building here that was demolished, and the space became apartment space. Now, this simple change would affect the surrounding facilities because people will have ample space for parking, and they may come to this space, to the square more, and they will, and the functions around will be far more active. is another example. If you just check if it's running well or if it's finished. Here a facade from Kobar, Saudi Arabia, that was a balcony that was transformed, and the setback here was also used, and the garage was transformed into a room. Let us think from San Francisco, the same building, how it was in the past, how it is changed now. This is from Kobar, Saudi Arabia. This was the original house, and its extension was added later. It's from Riyadh. This is the original building. Then the ground floor became grocery. A villa that became for the Red Crescent, which is the Red Cross here, is in Egypt. Imagine how things are changing. And almost, if you pass through any street and you ask yourself, what was the function of this building? And what is it now? For sure they are different. Yet when we design now, we design for specific functions. This is amazing. This is in Tunis, 2 different periods, cafe. Again from Tunis. Now we notice, usually, John Habraken divides the built environment into 2 types. Thematic and non-thematic. Thematic, which are like the music, there is a theme that repeats itself. Thematic is the everyday fabric, everyday tissue. Non-thematic are the sticking out buildings like church, mosque, parliament. Those buildings are rarely changed and not as frequent in change as the everyday environment. So this is a thematic building, and you see there is little change. Again, this is a thematic building, non-thematic building, sorry. The same shot in Tangier. Marrakesh, the same building. I visit, if I have postcards, I go to the same website and see what's happening later to take change. This is Tangier Square, you see. There is a building that is emerging here. And if you compare the facade and the usage of the street and the whole square is changed. Now, John Habraken wrote a book titled Transformation of the Site. This book was edited and published by MIT Press under the title The Structure of the Ordinary. And I do believe to some extent that this book is value-free in explaining the built environment. And I think it's a more important book to understand the built environment. And I think that most professionals intervene in the built environment that they don't understand. In that book, he tried to tell us how the built environment is composed, in which he argues that there is 3 orders, that whether we like it or not, that these 3 orders affects the structure of the built environment. The orders are the order of understanding, place, and form. I'll give example. In the order of form, he says that there is the order of supply. The goods always travel from one place to another in one direction. Electricity goes from one direction. Water in one direction. Sewage and so on. So the flow of goods from one place to another creates a hierarchy of dominance between the people and the users and the states and the organizations, companies, whatever, who are participating in the benefit of that pipe. Let's say that the municipality supplies the residents with water. So because the agency of water is in the upper stream, it is dominant over the people. The reverse is not possible. Gravity has its own, creates its own order. The people living in the ground floor, if they decided to do something in their ground floor, they will affect the upper floor neighbors. The opposite is not true. The same goes for flow of people. If you want to come from outside to here, you cannot, unless you have the permission from the outside gate controller. Although you have the right to come here, but if he does not allow you from there, you cannot come here. And it's very interesting to look at the different cultures from this perspective in terms of territorial structure. How the Chinese city is structured, that's different from the Mediterranean cities or Muslim cities, that's different from Europe, that's different. So territories and form creates hierarchy of dominance. The same goes for the order of understanding, which is not physical, but people understand each other through conventions, rules, regulations, fashions. People follow each other rules, either willingly as a fashion or forcibly as in rules and regulations. So if one understands these three orders, I advise you to read this book. For place understanding, one can understand the structure of the built environment in terms of dominance. Who has the upper hand? Who can control things? Who can force others to do things? Now let's look at, this is the background that where I'm coming from. Now here we have Tunis, a quite dense, compact area, but that doesn't mean it is dense in population. Now it's dense. That time when it was built for those people, it was not that dense. We notice that in the traditional environment, almost everywhere, not only in the Middle East, maybe the people don't want to demolish what they built again and again for new functions. So they thought wisely of trying to develop designs or built environments that costs minimum when transformed, whether to other functions or to other sizes. Let me give an example here from Tunis. You see, this is one house. This was originally one house. It was inherited, and then it was divided. This is the bigger court. It was divided. But this unit does not have access to the street after division, so they have this right of passageway outside. Here, for example, it's a nice exercise if you try and find a few changes. Here, for example, this sector was belonging to this one, now it is moved to this one. Maybe the owner of this house died, and he shifted some sectors of his house, some rooms, to the next neighbor, without much demolition. Here, for example, this sector was to this house, it was transformed. So if you look at the whole side, you see it is here, for example. People, when they want to, maybe a person had children and they migrated somewhere else, so he has a big house. He wants to reduce the size of his house. He just sell a room for his next neighbor. So this led to think of the built environment as sectors. That's why in the traditional environment, when they talk about buildings, they talk about names of spaces. Each space has a name, like an entrance, a bedroom, and so on. But our names now are functional. We say entrance, we say bedroom, we say... The traditional names were mostly not functional, but was positional. Describes the position of a space inside a larger context. This is a sunny room, this is a dark room, this is... and so forth. And this is the upper floor. clearly you can see how, like this accordion that they play music, the territories shift between properties over time without demolition. So the fabric is helping the people's required change over time, 100, 200, 300 years, without much demolition. Just closing a door or opening a door. And that's interesting, without much demolition. This is, for example, a house. This was a house. It was divided. This part was taken by this house. This part was taken by that house. This part was taken by this house. The house is gone. No more. It was between 3 houses. It disappeared. Now, in order to find a design tool in which users could participate in the future, now the architect designed the building and he goes away. Then the user could come 50, 20 years later, they want to change the function of the building. There will be much demolition. And this is important for sustainability. I think 30 years ago there was a conference about conservation and restoration. I said, in that conference, why do we always think of preserving the building of the past? Why don't we now design buildings that it will not be changed much in the future? They were laughing. How do you do that? Because you don't know what will happen. No, that's possible. We think of design as a means that allow other people through exercising their own decisions to reach their desired life requirements. They should be able to do that without much demolition. So we need a design tool for such task. What's that design tool? John Habraken noticed that in certain cultures, certain spaces behave in certain ways. For example, in Sweden, because it is dark most of the year, you like the sun. So the zones that are facing the outside is always utilized for living maybe, but not for toilets, not for storage, not for... So certain functions are pulled into the facade. And in some cultures, they want to push maybe in a certain area some functions to the inner courtyard. So facing the street or not facing the street is a tool that can allow us predict what the people will do in the future. Here, for example, let's say there is a street here, and we can tell, maybe, in Mediterranean city that there will be a zone here where a room could be here, another room could be here. That is always this room between 4 to 6 meters. Rarely it is less than 4 meters. And rarely it exceeds 6 meters. It is somewhere there. So we say there is a margin, there is zone here that they call alpha. You can call it any name. But it has certain characteristics. And this zone has a margin. There is always, for this space that facing the outside, there is a margin. Here I can see a margin. See? Where is the stick wall, there is windows, there is, you can use as shelves, as a book, case, or whatever. Sometimes it can extend in some cultures to the outside, where there is galleries, there is seating areas, there is... So always, in often cases, not always, this space that's facing outside has a margin. That is not outside, that's not inside. That can take both positions. And there is always next to this one. Now I can see here there is a zone. In this building there is a zone. Next to this one there is something in the middle. Another zone that is not facing outside, that's facing internal spaces. And there is certain function that goes here. We can detect that in different cultures, how they behave differently. In some cultures, they are very small. In some cultures, they are very large. So if we want to design for this culture, we understand how people use their daily life spaces. We absorb them, observe them, and transform it into design. Then there is another margin. Again, it could be large buildings maybe, another internal space, or could be a street, or whatever. Anyhow, we can look at the building as zones. And in the Netherlands, buildings are row houses. It was linear. In the Middle East, it doesn't have to be linear, for example. It can be squares, rectangles. Anyhow, you can develop your own tools to deal with this idea that we look at the environment as product of people that have certain customs. Through observation, we can know the sizes of these elements, the smallest and the largest, and there is a margin between them. This is a margin in Tunis. This is a margin. This is a margin in Turkey. This is a margin in Morocco, I guess. Now, another issue other than margin that what Jamel Akbar calls is sector. You can look at the built environment as connected sectors. If this building is, if this zone is running parallel to the facade, it is interrupted by walls carrying the roof that define a sector. But sector does not necessarily be between structural elements. So if we look at the traditional environment, we will notice that it is often composed of connected spaces that are similar in size. Maybe a court in the center, maybe a margin around it, and one or two types of spaces that when they repeat themselves, they work together and they make larger space, or one space can be divided into two possible spaces that can be used. Now, in our contemporary designs, when the designer comes, he has to design an embassy, he has to design, let's say, a school, or you will notice that the spaces are of all possible sizes. But then if they want to be transformed to something else, demolition has to be made. Sometimes they just demolish everything and keep the structural skeleton to refill the building again. So this business sector is very important. I translated to Arabic to containers. You see these big ships that have these containers for goods. Each container can be filled with different types of goods. If we thought of the built environment as sectors of different sizes, but when these sectors work together, they give us new possibilities, I think we could design something far more interesting. Here you see there is very well developed type. Yesterday we talked about conventions. And because the people were using land replication and the streets are not necessarily straight, when they insert the convention that they had about the built environment on the side, the preference observed the regular outline of the street as in here. But they are keeping this as much as possible. You see? Let me give one good example. This is the Ka'a house in Medina. And it's very, very interesting. Relationship between two spaces. This is space 1, space 4. One comes here, always there is next to this space a sitting area. From this space, one goes to this space where there is two sitting areas. This relationship keep repeating itself in all houses, almost all houses. Look at the floor plan of a large area of that quarter, and you see the same relationship. 1, 2, 3, those who are Arabic. The same relationship repeats itself. Why this? They're holding up to this convention because they know it works well. They're holding tight to it. And it is the central part, this one, is open all the way. This one is open all the way. So you can see it's here in the ground floor, in the upper floor, last floor. And this is an area view. These are the opening. And it's always this shape. Now, I was affected also by work by Samuel Anderson, where he argued that he is the person who invented the term robustness that is now much used in urban design. Robustness means that the physical environment, if it's capable of holding more functions, it is more robust. And he came up with the term latent environment, that a space could perform differently in a way that we never thought of when the people are changed. For example, now we have highways everywhere. If there is atomic war and no cars in the future, maybe in the future, 100 years from now, people will come and say, what is the reason for these bridges? Oh, it's a nice place to make a house beneath the bridge. That might happen. A person may use a cup for heating others, not drinking coffee. So there is different usage for that object. If you think of the built environment like that, and how with the change of culture over time, people reuse the space. For example, typing. Before there was secretaries everywhere in the university, type. Room for typing. Now that room does not exist because everybody is typing by himself. There was room for photocopying because everybody used to photocopy books, articles, papers. Now they just share it by email, read from an iPad. So advancement of technology, change of culture, all these change the built environment. So he invented this term called latent environment. Now the question is, how do we design latent environment? Abrakan had a good answer for that, and he invented the word support, which is the parts of the building that can be constructed. When the users move in, they fill that part, then it becomes habitable space, dwelling or shop or whatever. So it is the part of the elements beyond the control of the users. But if the architect is clever enough, he will develop a support that lasts longer in life with minimum demolition. So designing support does not mean flexibility. Because most people, when they think of the change, they immediately think of flexibility. They say, okay, we'll make 4 columns and a few columns inside the building. And then people can move around. No, the users who are not architects, the columns may hinder him from adapting to change. Because the distances between the columns may take 1 function but 2 functions. May take 1.5 function. So a good building that adapts change does not mean less elements, but it might mean more elements that would help the users in the future and say, this is a sunny place, I can make it living room. This is a dark place, I can make it kitchen, and so on. So it helps the users and guide the users to reinvent the space. And this is a challenge. Let's take this example, for example. Here, I took just this part, I gave it to a student. Just this part. Let's see what's happening. Just explore this relationship. This is that part, he flipped it mirror image. I hope you excuse the writing because the guy who did that scanning need correction. Okay? It was used differently each time. Sometimes living, sometimes classroom, restaurants. And it reveals different potentiality. Now we put it, now it is two joined together, now it's three. We're just playing with it and to see how it works. Why do we do this exercise? We hope to understand what elements should go where. For example, a clever architect may say, okay, I'll make a column in the corner there to allow the people more usage. Inside that column, I could put the electric wires, pipe, water pipes, and it is supported column. What he did now is that he tied three live systems together, and I like this term, George Bracken, live system. What he did at that time, he brought three elements that are live. The electric system is one system, the water system another, and the structural system is a third. He put them together in one place that would make it difficult for user change in the future the site. These three elements should be almost separate. So it's always difficult to decide where the duct goes in the building. This is another example of exploring a safety typology. This is an example of, you can say, a failed example where the architect, I think 17th, 18th century in Istanbul, designed a storage. It was storage first. Simply because it's designed in that fashion, it does not accommodate much change. It was difficult to change because it was designed for a specific function as a storage. Now they are redesigning it to fit new functions, and you can see corridor without light and so on. This is another example of a student who observed in Istanbul this structure. So they kept the outside as it is, and it was transformed to another function. Let me take one example in more detail. This was a factory for cannonball during the Ottoman Empire. And I asked the students, this is 18 by 550, to redesign that space to test the potentiality of the space or the latency of the space. This was the interpretation of the students. This is a bank. These are fixed. They are not supposed to touch these. And because there are few students, I gave each one fixed walls that he should not touch. Medical clinic. These are two second year students, by the way. They're not third. each time different interpretation within the same physical form. What I was trying to say is that the built environment, because it's constantly changing, and we designers are designing something with a specific function that lately is difficult to change in the future, and we have to find a method to adapt to change. This means that we not necessarily design buildings, but rather we create a system that becomes building that adapt to change. So what is the system? Let me take this example that was designed by Jamel Akbar and I did the drawing, where the system is large I-beam, slab that can come here or there, and this I-beam is running parallel, carried by walls, by columns, and it could be like this in the side. This is square, this is large building, and these are the columns that carries that I-beam. So there is varieties of distances here that is another study that would add more potentiality to the site. So this is the I-beams and this is the columns. Now we can plane the section and we can have varieties of heights in the section because of the I-beam. Street, two sides. Now, if you remember in the beginning, I talked about margins, and that this is the zone in this building, and there is a margin, and there is another zone there that is not facing the outside. That it will draw functions to it simply because facing the facade. The same here, there is zone here, that we call alpha zone, and there is internal zone here. Between these two zones, there is zone. So we should expect certain functions from observation that can be drawn into these zones, that the user most likely will do that in the future. Another type of this commercial, the ground floor, residential. Now this is the interpretation of one of the students, the American student, of how the floor plans can work. This is my drawing. That time there was no computer, so it's hand drawing. And you can see there is small size unit, larger size unit, units that are divided into this part, second part, and so on. So there is hundreds of possibilities that can fit the system. And this could survive the user's needs in the future without much demolition. And that's good for sustainability. This is another student's work. A third student's work. Now, unfortunately, this line of thinking stopped. It continued within the capitalist system. If you remember the first day we talked about capitalism and three essences for accessibility for resources, knowledge, and permissions. Because capitalism continued, and especially Reaganism, Thatcherism, the 80s, and so on, Jamel Akbar was retired, and this line of thinking continued fast within the capitalist system, which we know now the open system. The open system started from this method. Now we see in the office buildings, they have open space, they rent you a space with a few columns and surfaces. The origin of that is from here, but because of the economic structure, the investors has to lean to the user's request, so they sell them spaces with maximum freedom. And it flourished well in office buildings, but not in the housing sector. So this line somehow stopped of research. Hopefully it will come back. Now I'll show you a design that I made, trying to create space that's adaptable to change. This is a traditional type house in Saudi Arabia, but this is not important. I just show you to show you where I'm coming from in the design. And you can use the pattern language of Crystal Alexander or whatever to express your values about how you want the built environment to be. But it's important here to realize that later people will come with different value systems than mine to reinterpret the space for a more robust or latent environment. So I decided to design a support for courtyard. So the courtyard has its own beauty, its own patterns, its own character. We will pass through these, so you can always interpret the courtyard, how it works in terms of privacy, how it works in terms of accessibility, how it works in terms of being a loop, that people can go around it, that accessibility, how it works. But this is not important because it's my values. Now, we'll go through fast. Now, the system goes as follows, works as follows. There is build zone, and there is open build to the street. And there is open zone, and there is open build. Build zone, open build. These two build zone has a space in the middle that's open that might hold the courtyard. The same thing, mirror image. So it starts simple, but then it gets a bit complicated, but it's very simple. And the system, to be understood by the people, it has to be very simple. But when they interpret the site, it will give them what they need. Although it might look complicated for outsiders, but for the users, it is simple. And between these two build zones, there is open zone. And now this is the build zone. This is the zone that's facing the outside, and this is the margin, and this is the margin. This is where the location, where the courtyard can go to these locations. These are the elements, the black ones are the elements that code support, where the user, in this case, should fill in between them to make their dwellings. So this is the ground floor, a zone between inside and outside, facing the facade, a courtyard area, and the margin between the same and the back. In the upper floor, there is two zones, facing outside. Now the first decision, if you remember when we showed the Tunis, where with minimum demolition, the size of properties increase or reduce in size. The same here, because the design thought of as sectors. This is the smallest possible unit, and this is one of the largest possible units. Now somebody will say, well, we are used to look at the built environment as rectangulars of parcels, or squares of parcels, and not zigzag. Now, in the traditional environment, people used to buy and sell spaces that has names. Not functional name, but positional names. So this is the smallest unit, larger unit in the upper floor. So the first decision to be made, maybe by the government, because the people are different in sizes, they will give them different sizes. Maybe by a developer who want to develop a site for profit and sell it. At least he can have different possibilities. A student living alone, we may take this side. A big family may take this side. So there is this option always for providing varieties of sizes. The second layer of decision is that if we put the support back to back, this area that's open built, could have the possibility of developing a ternary street between different units. Or it could have the possibility of having a small garden or a play area for children with in a hot area with overpass, or small terrace, or terrace plus larger terrace plus a garden, narrow street, or even the property line can have these possibilities. So the internal street could be like that, or dead-end street, or it could be no dead-end street, but connected units. Now the third layer of decisions is that in the space allocated for courtyard, these plates made of concrete, of steel, or whatever, could be placed here between these 9 I-beam columns, where the size of the courtyard could be large like this, or could be small like this one. Or it could be in the center, bigger in the upper floor, smaller here, or it could be from the side, or it could be larger from the side. Hundreds of possibilities. Because each time I can put the opening of the courtyard here, or there, or there with different sizes. And I can shift them around, depending on the people's request. And gradually we know now maybe a developer will build it and sell it. He will go away, we go away, 100 years from later. Now, what happens? The newcomers will change it for different function. And they may change the location of the courtyard without much demolition. And this is good for sustainability. Now, in order to reach a level of making sure that the spaces between the support elements are almost not completely right, closer to the limit than others. This is also a chart that developed originally by Jamel Akbar, where it goes from 60 by 60, increases every 30 centimeters. And for each function, we can make a chart. So I can say, for example, the smallest area is 30 by 60 for a washing basin, and maybe one small toilet or toilet with a bathtub. So each culture will have its own chart to some extent. And I can draw the line and say, okay, my value says that only I cannot go smaller than this. And this is the line that I will draw for the functions and the spaces that's acceptable to me, according to my values. This is in a linear fashion. 210 is the smallest possible place for the oven and cabinet, maybe the kitchen cabinet, maybe one person bed. I cannot have 2-person bed, and this is the first time maybe I can have a 2-person bed, and so on, and it gets larger. So I'm trying to find the critical dimensions for the spaces that I will use for the support. The same goes for garage, for all the other functions in the zones. So this chart, for example, explains the zones usage. For each zone, we have to develop a chart. Then we expand the zone, reduce the zone, expand the margin, reduce the margin. to come up with find the possible layout of the support elements in this is a zone, and this is one sector. That takes two margins. This is one sector, takes one margin. This is divided by two. This is small toilet with a one-person bedroom. This is an entrance hall. So these are the elements that I can introduce according to my values in these sectors. This sector, other sectors. So each time, this analysis for this sector, this analysis for this sector. So we go by through them one by one. That's why architects don't like it, because it's tedious work, too much work to design a support. Another possibilities, there is the margin here to the courtyard. Exactly, this sector here, this is the zone. Now, if we place those physical elements that are simple into the support and easier for users to handle, doesn't need much intervention by construction people, we could have this type of floor plans. I'm not asking you to accept this design. What I'm trying to do is convince you that we should think differently of the built environment that we are designing as if we will not change. And it constantly changes. This is the ground floor, for example, of this is a large entrance for apartments going up, another unit, third, fourth unit. This is a unit, for example, larger unit, for example, a person, maybe his mother is living here, or his son, or whatever, and there is still the family there. So when they go up, they are split into two wings. And this is one of the smallest elements, and so on. This is section. Now, what you've seen is my interpretation. So I gave it to other students to interpret it differently. This is an Egyptian student. He looked at the same sectors, and he interpreted them differently. Because there is in Egypt daily activities like small workshop for carpenter, for laundry, and so on. So he tried to fit those services into the support. This is another student who said, okay, let's do it this way. And I think this example failed. Why? Because my support was rigid, was not systematic. Now I have to think of it, rethink of it again as a system. What alerted me is that this student, he said, okay, why don't you think of it as not one support, but two linear running parallel. At that case, you can have unit like this, unit like this, you can have units like this, and one large shared courtyard for other smaller units. Because there is no large families maybe in that part of the world, there is smaller families. There's another interpretation by another student. So I said, okay, now we have to rethink the support. It failed. Because it did not work very well with those students. So one goes through circles and circles and circles of evaluation. So, okay, in the tissue level, or in the urban design level, it does not work. How can I do it? Like this? No, it's quite rigid. It does not fit site that is topographically is not does not support rectangular parcels. So a study was made about the parkings, about the cars, and so on. And this is quite rigid, as you see. Very rigid, because the dead-end street, the side streets, and so on. This does not resemble the traditional fabric where things are quite more smooth. how it works in the dead-end street. Does it work here? Fine. So we have to develop the system. To do that, first we have to study the potentiality of the street. Maybe you won't feel that here, but because most streets are one way, but in the Middle East, sometimes you're going this way, another car coming this way. You say, if the street is 1 meter wide, we both could have, 60 centimeter wide, could have both passed. So the street is not for its maximum potentiality. To do that, we have to study the potentiality of the street. And now, unfortunately, what they do in urban design, they take a site, they ask the student to redesign that site, or improve the site, and so on, and they think of functions and locations of elements, and make a theater here, or a bus station, and so on. I think it should go exactly the opposite. You look at the fabric and the property rights and the parcels there and see what are the possible potentialities that come out of these constraints. And we explore the potentialities, then we select from those potentialities what is the possible solution that goes in line with our budget. So now I have to look at each sector, analyze that sector, and how it goes, how it might go if it bent. So for each sector, a chart was developed. Little bent, more bent, maximum bent, and so on. Each sector was analyzed to develop almost a guideline for those who will come later if the support was implemented. Now, this is another student. He is the dean now of the School of Architecture. It is the largest school in the Middle East. We have almost 120 faculty, 5 departments. He did his master with me, and there was a street in Kubar city. It was called Residential Street. With the oil boom, gradually, suddenly, the street, nobody knows why, but specifically that street became heavily commercial street, the most active street. We wondered why this specific street, not some other streets. So we have to look at the larger picture of the town, and we noticed that it is 2/3 away from the sea coast to the new area. Anyhow, that's detail, that's not important. But what was interesting, that this outline design was originally done by Americans when they came for oil. They are the ones who made out this rectangular blocks. So he looked at those rectangular blocks and said, okay, I will design a support to fit those blocks, because we cannot control the street layout. We cannot intervene in that. Only we have to respect that and design within it. So he proposed this layout design. Sorry for the bad slides. Then he proposed this type of columns and this type of support. So the area can be transformed in the future through residential, because we know that area might be commercial. It can be transformed easily from residential to commercial. Thank you.
All right, so let's open up for discussions and questions. Give a little bit of time to think. Otherwise, I will start.
Can we put this up so it's please?
think in a way now there are more and more maybe around these first experiments that you were trying to include change and also the possibility for the user to continue to build and change the structures. I think there are more and more among the younger generation. I'm thinking especially architects in South America that in a way maybe are thinking back to a system that allowed that possibility of change. So I'm thinking about, for example, Elemental, Leandro, Abarena. It's one of the very more publicized projects which somehow we're trying maybe to incorporate. So my first question would be how, if you see these attempts closer to what you were trying maybe to do. But also my question, I think, has to do also with maybe thinking together if it is always true that the most adaptable buildings are the ones that are not designed for a specific function. Because sometimes I feel this can be even the opposite. Sometimes there are buildings that actually were designed for very strictly and very in a way that should actually solve a single function, and then incredibly people actually or events made this building being reused in a very different way. So I'm also, in that sense, trying to understand if it is totally true, because the other line that went into the idea of that you also maybe would be good also to clarify why you don't call this a flexible system, because the other line leads to this completely anonymous buildings that arrive, let's say, to the topology of a skyscraper in which there is just a system of columns, with the idea that this is the most flexible, but this is the less flexible space, I would say. So I think because what is lost in this process is then the possibility to have spaces that are heavily characterized, that actually they have a life in them, and not just this very anonymous buildings that is now the corporate world. It's logged into that. You were saying this is the other line that actually was brought by neoliberalism, that in a way, if I have to think about what could be a kind of archetype of architecture, it's the idea of a skyscraper and the flexibility of a space that it can be always readapted. And even though you started from a very different kind of entry, which was the historical environment, the traditional environment, which actually buildings are heavily characterized. So, if there are maybe two, because I'm thinking while I was maybe trying to make the question, but there are two questions. One, it was if you see this more attempts from architects, especially from South America, how do you see these attempts that were maybe aligned of what you were investigating to? And also the second part has to do with the fact, are we totally sure that somehow a building can be reused differently if it's not designed for a specific function, or sometimes actually can have a very specific way of being designed for specific functions, but it can be very much actually reused.
Okay, thank you. Well, in theory, one can squeeze any function in a building with more adjustments, and if not, sometimes the squeeze may not be, the function may not perform well simply because it was squeezed. That's in theory. And we cannot tell whether this building is functioning very well because we usually, I don't know why, architects, when they design building, they leave, rarely they come back to their buildings and see how it's performing. But if they come back and sometimes they're dead, the change can happen after 100 years. But let's think of it this way. If we said there is a flexible building and I put columns, maybe a column is difficult for the user to connect from 3 sides or 4 sides, because technically it requires more work. But if there's two walls, I can just connect between the two walls, they have a space that we can utilize. It is much more easier. That's why I said it's one of the most difficult things is to decide where the ducts is. And I've seen many office buildings that have flexible floor plans, but when the users come to inhabit the site, they don't know what to do. They say, this space is so large for an office, but it's too small for two offices. What do we do? Simply because the parcel in the beginning had a size, then by the rules and regulations of the municipalities, part has to be left as front yard or backyard. What's left has to be designed. Then the building has to be carried by columns. So locations of the columns, according to budget, might dictate the design, but because it's not designed, they just give it to the user as open space. The user comes. The other day I was walking in Istanbul and there's commercial street and the building was built and they were casting the staircase as concrete. I said, oh my God, this is a major mistake because 1 month later, after they inhabit the site, they realized that no, this is not the right place for the staircase. It has to go somewhere else. In that specific case, the staircase should be dealt with as a piece of furniture, not as structural element. Once I went to a hotel in Morocco, and when I went to the hotel, they tiled the wall with ceramic, and rather than having a headboard, the ceramic was like this, it goes up, down. So by ceramic, they developed the headboard. What they did, in fact, is that they transformed the bed into the level of the wall. Why? Because the bed always has to be there, fixed in that position, because of the headboard that's made of ceramic. So we brought the level of this furniture into the level of wall. In the first case that I gave in the staircase, the element that's supposed to be furniture became. That's why I started this lecture by saying it's important to read John Habraken's book. He talks about order of four place understanding, where if we understood the physical environment, the built environment, as component of these three orders, we can understand the relationship of dominance between those who are acting and shaping the built environment. Then we can intervene, the whole issue of intervention. Then we can intervene and develop the outline that would help the user in the future easily to change the building to their required function. About those guys in Latin America, I really don't know much about that because this line of research, I was busy with that book for 20 years, scissoring, right? So I left this line of research for 20 years. Now I'm coming back to it because it connects with property rights and visual rights.
Yeah, I mean, I would like a bit to try to understand how to connect with your previous 2 days, and then when we come to architecture, things might sometimes got lost. No, it's and you know, yesterday you mentioned one thing that I wanted to ask you about, but I didn't have the chance. Is that when you say that as soon as colonizers arrived, the first thing they did is that they destroyed the walls of around the city, and this makes the whole city completely different. And he was a bit speaking about how walls make a complete, I mean, why walls, why not walls? And in that sense, you know, at least in my experience, I faced very much the whole, in refugee camps, people, even if they have a space of square, they want 4 walls there because it helps them managing the whole place, right? So, and I didn't saw a lot, and from one, on the other side, you spoke about margins and what happened in these margins as negotiation between the people, but then, you know, when it comes to a sort of, I didn't see how these walls are still standing in your case and how margins are working. So I would have thought from my side that we begin from the walls and the margins that negotiate relation between people rather than to sort of get from the internals to the, I don't know, I can understand that there is this structure of internals and margins, but I would have thought from your first two lectures that we would more negotiate than how far is my wall from your wall and what is it that can brings us together in that space, that architecture can go into this rather than, to go back to say, how can I, so the space would be changed and the flexibility is about how that tissue would be developed throughout the relation with people. And, I have to say that this part didn't very much answer for me your first two lectures. I sort of felt that there need to be more around where we sort of negotiate the spaces, that I saw less. And this, of course, happens normally whenever we translate all this theory into architecture. All that I myself and I would get lost in the, but I sort of, what I am asking for is if you can answer me of what is the role of that wall that you spoke about in the traditional cities that are major part of how negotiation among people are sort of sorted out, and then how are the margins and the relation between people will take place in the architecture you sort of try to propose as in that sense.
Okay, can we just run this again because I need to see this slide.
Maybe to just develop my thought, so for us to understand, one of the major things, when we designed a sort of neighborhood in Gaza, people sort of put for us three major things. One is that they want their living room to be accessible from the outside, so they can still be having a difference between the private and the living room. And this was a major point that they raised out, is that what is the transition between the public and the private? How I would sort of, get from one side to another. And I thought that when you were speaking about the margins, this is what majorly we are speaking about, is that how we go from these spaces of the transition between what is private and what is public, and what was the major, I think, essence of how the traditional cities are sort of was formed, no? And from our observation to Gaza is that whenever you have three walls, any three walls that comes together, then people would gather. If they are only two, it's hardly you see anybody there. So, I would like you to sort of more help me into this.
Remember the first lecture we talked about this slide, and we talked about the people reselling the elements of the building that they demolished. So these are the remains of buildings that are demolished. So an argument that comes here, maybe the traditional environment is more industrialized than the contemporary environment. What does this mean? In the traditional environment, they may use bricks, they produce doors that can go directly from here to that site. In the site, they make the opening, I come to your question, but it's wrong. Yeah. In the site, they make the opening exactly as this door. Then they take this door and fix it on the site. Now, in most countries, they do it differently. They make the opening, and somebody else come and take the measurement and cast the door or the window or whatever. So if you like, the traditional environment is more industrialized than ours today. Although it doesn't look industrialized because it is quite primitive technology. Now it's advanced technology, but it's not as industrialized as in the past. A good example is the ceiling wood, where it has certain size, so the rooms had to be certain size. Now, it is not. You can have larger spans. Now, it is who decides. It is who decides. the people who originally built these walls and these windows, when they made the decisions, they made it keeping in mind that one day it might be sold. And the carpenter who did it for them, he followed certain conventions. That's why in the traditional environment we see building similarities. That similarity because of those elements that can be reused again and again and again. So the decision of deciding conventions that came out, that we talked about this, from the people bottom up. So they have very good understanding of the location of windows, doors, and so on, and the size of the spaces. So it is a convention. Now, let's see this one. And we talk that if the people had accessibility to knowledge, free knowledge, permissions, resources, we should expect the structure of the society will be composed of people quite similar in their income, and that the production industry will be composed of people who work in their own production line. The owners of the company are the workers, and not like our situation. Now, what does this relate to your question? Because everything is based on convention, and the people had the power. In that case, if we design the support, the zones on the margin most likely will reflect what the people decided and they agreed upon. We absorb that, and the role of the architect will become an enabler, because the people had access to resources, because they developed the conventions, they're less likely to disagree. And then when the architect sits with them, almost everybody understands it, and there is little disagreement. Now, if we remember also that the square is in the unified form of submission, where the people surrounding the courtyard are in control, even if they disagree, because they have shared interest, most likely they will resolve their disagreement fast. Here becomes the role of the architect when he looked at the margins, for example. In some cultures, the margin could be that much, just wall. In the central region of Saudi Arabia, it's just wall. Here, it's quite swollen. I've noticed in Sweden, it's all. In some other cultures, like Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, people are always inside, outside. You can say almost everything is inside, outside. So the margin is large. So the surrounding circumstances, climate, building materials, and so on, to a large extent affects the margins that are absorbed by the architect, that is transformed into support, that little dispute will happen. But what I was proposing now, today, is how do we act today as an architect within our capitalist system, rather than having a government through the Ministry of Housing building hundreds of dwellings with the same typology or even 2-3 types, or rather than site and services where they give the people just the land with the services, and then the people don't know what to do with the parcel, because we are living in an era where users are ignorant of housing knowledge or environmental knowledge, so they make a mistake. This proposal could be accepted, but it's not the ultimate acceptable proposal for me, because I am operating within a capitalist society now. I have to accept that. But if what I was hoping to change to this structure, to have sustainable environment, in that case, the role of the architect will be different, because there is clear conventions, as I showed in Medina, of housing type that everybody likes, everybody wants, and the type or the pattern will be developed for each specific usage. For housing, there will be type for the Ottoman Mosque is a good example. That was originally from Hagia Sophia. They liked the pattern, regardless of its origin. They liked it. They copied and improved it. All over the Ottoman Empire, the same mosque. But that doesn't mean I like the mosque. But it has negative side of it because it represents a power. If you build that mosque, for example, in Damascus, and the people copy that mosque because they like it, it's built by stone. Maybe the area does not have stone. So the prayer space, temple, mosque, church, whatever, if it grew out of the site itself, from the people's conventions, using local materials, that's far more sustainable. Remember that example from Bangladesh, the parliament with the people? So what I'm representing today is accepting today's capitalism system. I hope to answer it. Yes?
Maybe I'm repeating a bit Sandy's question, but in one of the, maybe it was yesterday, there was at some point, there was a scheme with, in your presentation, there was a scheme with like some bubbles of unit A is content, is inside a larger unit B and a larger unit B.
The territorial structure.
Yes. So this reminds me of Charles Correa's project for Bellapur, and in which it's a bit like the system you proposed. The houses are incremental, so there is a space for the users to build a larger house and like contained in one structure. But the scheme is also proposing the same system for an more urban scale. So, and like different, if you assemble different units, then it creates a courtyard, and different courtyard assembled like are sharing a larger space, collective space. So I just wanted to ask you if in your system you thought about the same, not flexibility, but the same system, but more in an urban scale, because it was really focused on the housing unit itself, and the urban scheme that we could see in your drawings is more like bars or more like linear urban schemes. And so I thought, did you develop something more that could echo maybe with this little scheme you showed yesterday?
Okay, just to give you a quick history about the subject. In 1961, John Habrakan's book came, Supports. Then I think in the early 70s it was translated to English, then it spread. So the whole concept of participation emerged. Then John Turner's book came, Housing by People, which we talked about Latin America and how the problem is not resources, but who decides. So you have two extremes. Habrakan's proposing something to be built, John F. Taylor supporting or arguing for decision-making process. Between these two, many movements came. One of them is Charles Correa's building, where you build a nuclear element that can expand gradually, but he has to make exercises how it might look after expansion. Now, I'm not saying that this is good or that's good. Each situation has its own advantages. What I was arguing for is that we architects, when we design buildings for a specific function. We should think of it, although designed for that specific client, for a specific function, that it might change in the future. and accordingly change our designs, that it will be used differently in the future. Now, if you look at most design projects, a client hire an architect, the architect design for the client what he wants. I'm not talking about monuments, about banks and so on, but the everyday environment. That is the missing element. So I'm not proposing a solution for housing problem. No, one could argue with me and say, no, give just the people the money and they would build. They have their own conventions. Why do you build support for them? That's a very powerful argument. So I'm not arguing that this is a housing solution. No, I'm arguing for changing our attitudes as professionals in design, that we should think of the future. At least if you want sustainable environment. I forgot the number, maybe 30 or 20% of the waste is building materials. Quite large number. 10% of the people work in the building industry if you count the architects, the laborers, and everyone. And if this transformed into conventions that everybody understands, and with minimum change, we will save so much manpower in production that can go into education, into medicine, into something else. Being very specific in design is costing our societies today.
I have a question, but I wait others. Oh, okay. I mean, I have two questions. I don't know from where to begin, but I will begin with the first one. Maybe I am trying to understand if we should focus more on how this architecture would sort of be possible to change in the future, but I see this as a second question. I mean, I'm still lacking the first question on how we create structure that would permit people actually to live this way. So maybe what I am missing, what I'm trying to still be nagging on, is that I can understand fully the whole argument of sustainability in that sense. But I believe that, as what I understood from you, that sustainability will come by consequences if people will be able to live this way. And what I am still lacking is that what are the elements that would help us sort of understanding how this is a possible model. And this would bring me to my second question now. And so my first question is that, is it the right question to say how can we create an architecture that can change, or how can we create an architecture where people can still be self-organizing themselves? No, this is my first argument. The second one is bringing me to an example that actually make me ask this first question. And my example is, you know, when I was working in the refugee camps, and we had to deal with a very tiny, small square, no, of 500 meters square, where we decided to buy two small, tiny houses, destroy them, and create a bigger space in the environment. And this created a huge anxiety among the inhabitants, because they felt, what is it? And we never know how to deal with a bigger sort of space in the middle of housing, and what that might mean. And there was a lot of discussion among the community if this is even possible or not. They were afraid that this would create conflict that even might bring us to kill some people on the spaces, because the space is so rare in refugee camps. And in the same camp where we were operating, few people were killed on a dispute on the street. So people were afraid how this would look like. And one of the solutions that they come all with is that this place should be turned into a semi-private, semi-public space, where there would be walls and doors, 4 doors and 4 walls, where people can get in and out and feel the responsibility of getting into a place. Because they thought that if there would be no walls and no thresholds and no doors to get in, they alone, without a government, cannot govern the place. So what I am asking here, what are possible architectural models that we can still be learning from the traditional, because in Fawar they figured out that they give me one simple example. They say, you know, if a pregnant woman would be walking in the street and she will find herself suddenly in this big square, and something will happen to her, like a kid is playing on the ground and he's hitting her with the football, no, and she's hit and taken to the hospital. Who will be taken care of? Who will be held responsible? And coming back to your argument around responsibility, who will be held responsible for this? The kid that is playing in a place where he should play, or the woman that happened by chance in that place and it was not her fault? So they told me, in order to avoid all this, we need the woman to decide to get inside this door, so she will cross the threshold, and means in that sense that she is taking the responsibility to get into a place where there might be children playing. If we don't give her this possibility, she cannot be held responsible for her actions. So what I am saying is that what are architectural elements that would make possible for people to sort of be held responsible of what they are doing and what they are doing, and therefore, I mean, responsibility might be a major issue in us designing and thinking about the design of the thing, and in that sense, maybe I would like to ask you to help me understanding why people wanted these walls. I mean, from your perspective, if somebody would tell you this was a story that happened with me, why people insisted on these doors from your perspective and theory.
Yeah. Okay, nice, very good question. Well, of course, I don't have a magic answer for it.
I need to be helped to
What the people
understand.
want. But as I said yesterday, the refugee camp is not a normal situation where people do not have access to resources or knowledge or permissions. They are poor, they have their own freedoms, of course, but within the limitation they have. And that's a unique case. But still, if we look at this structure that I showed yesterday, this is a house. They have shared space, and collectively, like maybe they have another shared space, and those together make one party that, like same level parties, they have larger space. And what you were asking about, that they added there were two properties and they expanded this. And they don't know exactly how to go about it because it is dangerous for women passing by, maybe. Now, who controls? This is the question. And who controls should be responsibility. If in our existing situation, the authority is in control, usually the authority decides that there will be war or there be no war. I'm coming to it here. Okay? Because the authority decided, there is no dialogue between the people to have the proper solution, because they are not intervening. They don't decide. The decision made by the authority maybe later in the future will be changed because an accident happened. So it takes so much time, maybe 3-4 women dead in similar refugee camps, then they will say, okay, let's build a wall. So what's important here is the speed of knowledge development. It's quite slow when the central authority decides. But if the people has the power to decide whatever they want, there will be continuous debate and dialogue. And maybe they will decide not to have a war and the woman will die. That's very, very possible. But then they will say, okay, we have so many women pregnant. It's not only one. If it's one, say, okay, we'll finish from the property. They say, okay, we'll have so many women pregnant. It's better to build a wall.
That's true.
Now, knowledge developed among the people about what to do about this specific problem. That knowledge is transmitted to other sides if the people have power. So I don't have specific answer to your situation, but I will say is that because of the structure of the society, whether people has access to resources or no, they're powerful or no, knowledge accordingly developed, and then there will be conventions whether for this area, what is the best possible solution, walls or no walls? Or maybe just lines on the floor, or maybe we just raise the ground a little bit, so, or fence the playground or whatever. Or we just allow everything, make it without walls except football, you cannot play football. Or make signs that pregnant women should not pass there. So I don't have solution. And that's what architects do, and planners do, they have solutions. And these solutions hinders the development of conventions. Because these solutions are imposed on the people by the central authority. This is the whole problem. Your question is very, very interesting from this perspective, because it hinders the development of solutions. What we need is solutions that respects the people's need. This only comes through trial and error. That's why yesterday I showed several slides how people try something, sometimes stupid solution, but they forget about it, they don't repeat it. A successful solution, maybe the person is in very critical position, he can see the possibilities of the site, he invents a solution, the people like it, repeat it, becomes convention. Yes? Okay, I think everybody tired. Do you suggest you stop here? Or you have a question?
Maybe I don't know. For me, maybe the last question. I was also trying to put this. Now that we have these three different moments of your research, I would be interested to know more if you give us a little bit more the context, almost the biographical context in which you develop these three different research questions or even approaches. So as you said, for example, in the lecture of yesterday, this was a specific time, also in which you were living in the States. So I for me, it would be in that sense more interesting also to try to imagine how this research trajectory was moved linked to your personal experience in the place where you were to, and how that resonate or not, the proximity and the distance with Saudi Arabia or with the West, and if that is and how that influenced some of the questions that you had in this sort of research. And then to maybe a little bit strange observation, but maybe it's also a question, because there is always this sort of almost Kabbalah kind of tree as a number, which is you had when you talked about the form of domination. There are three forms of domination. You talk about the other important point that you made: resources, access, and knowledge. I'm wondering if you will acknowledge or not there is a sort of also almost a theological understanding of the monotheistic religions that still read reality through this kind of lens, or not, or it's just a wide hypothesis.
Okay, very good question. Well, the first question is linking these three. As I said yesterday, the title of the book was Crisis Environment. And crisis comes from Thomas Kuhn's use of knowledge progress. That there is paradigms and there is anomalies, and suddenly there is dead end. So we need new paradigm to come out of this thing. And I feel that whether in the Western culture or any other cultures, the profession of architecture and planning and design are in dead end, because they are operating within the capitalist system, so they are serving the capitalist system, and that capitalist system, as I argued the first day, will lead to unsustainable environment. No way out of it. We are heading to polluted environment, simply because that monopolization of these resources that Ria talked about led to the creation of highly unemployed poor people, serving higher class, so consumption increased and so on. There's no way out of that. So what I was arguing is that people are people in all cultures, regardless of their outfit or their habits and so on. There is basic human tendencies. People like to expand, people reduce, reject interventions of others and so on. Those basic human tendencies, if we're manipulated, we will have this type of consumption that leads to this type of pollutions. How do we go out of it? I took in the second lecture the example of responsibility, where I was arguing that we need a new paradigm of developing new theories and proposing one, others will propose others. But we have to come out of this debate of proposing new ideas. But we cannot only think of architecture and urban design within the capitalist system, because changing the capitalist system needs, God knows, what type of revolution. Where it will go, we don't know. But at least if we had studies like these, measuring responsibility, participation in design and so on, we might sense a future, a bright future that would make the people, especially in the West, to move ahead. Because here it's easy for you to change to change governments. In other parts of the world, it's like Egypt, it's impossible. So we need change. What I'm trying to do from my own profession as an architect, contribute to that by looking at these three levels: the highest level, the economic system, then the professional level, then the practical level. So this is my answer for the whole thing.
I think having posed so many questions these days is very much that I felt the need to digest what you have presented. So, I mean, I have this feeling that I will have 10 questions in 2 weeks. Then I hope at least we will at least meet. We can continue all of the conversations from here. But I think two things that I think has been reoccurring during these 3 days, which has been brought up, and I think you, Sandy, pointed out, coming back to this responsibility a couple of times. So this, I mean, first of all, I think I would like to thank you actually for this, that you have this trust in people, which is rare today. I would say it's something that we are lacking, this trust in that people could feel this responsibility. But, and this is, I mean, how I perceive it, the 3 days is very much about the possibilities to create conditions for responsibility. So, but we have touched upon it, but I'm also curious, because I mean, that one answer is, because I'm curious of going back to this, that of course we need resources, knowledge, permission. I'm with you so long, but we haven't spoke so much about, I mean, how coming from here to there. I mean, without, I mean, highlighting this way there, we risk almost naturalize something if we're not speaking also about the obstacles for us coming there. So I would be curious for you to elaborate, to say something about what are the main, and of course we have already somehow you have spoken about it these days, but I would like to take the chance to hear you again speak about the obstacles you see today for people to be able to feel this responsibility. And the other thing, responsibility and all the other questions, which is the same thing, the obstacles you see today for us to perceive change. Because I think this is the other concept that has been reoccurring these 3 days, and that I read already the first day, was very happy for Because I mean, there is very strong forces today that we could say that today's world is the only possible. That we couldn't organize it in any other way. There's no better way to organize the world. And I mean, I think this is something that I personally struggle with every day. I mean, how could I at least get what are the tools to imagine other possible ways of organizing everyday life? And so this was also that I would like to thank you that you already from the beginning had tried to do this. So also like, what are the main obstacles also for us to see change? I mean, I understand there are huge questions, but I would love if you would like to say
Yeah,
something.
it's two important questions. How do we move from theory to be realistic, and how can we implement it? I am the only person who are fighting in this. I hope others will join. There is people like David Harvey, and I show you some of them that they're trying. But the thing that most of them did not look at or explore is the condition that people should have access to these three without any control for any intervention. This, I think, is a contribution that should be looked upon compared to the production of goods that are here, are the necessities, complementary and so on. And I think this is important, but how do we get there in practice to implement that? I think it needs the cooperation of so many people in research, in bringing awareness to the people about this, especially to theorists like David Harvey or Jamel Akbar or these guys that, hey, listen, there is some other way of looking at things. Through awareness, with more and more research, we can see the positives and the negatives. But we have to move, because as I showed you, that we need, in the best cases like the Scandinavian countries where everything is transparent with the government, where the people had almost all power and so on. If we keep living like that, we need 5, 6 Earth to sustain this type of living. That has to change. We cannot continue like this. But that does not mean we should change with lower or backwarded situation with lower consumption. No, but our attitude should change. How we get there? It has to be studied. It has to be explored. But we have to think of way out of our situation. So my answer that yes, we need cooperation. We need awareness. First, awareness. We should talk about the subject. The subject is not talked about. They are thinking of solving sustainability issues within the current paradigms. And there is no way out. That's why I try to. If you agree with me, the first state that we are heading to a sustainable environment, then what do we do? Bring awareness, think outside these paradigms, and that is what's needed. Thank you for your understanding. Regarding the issue of connecting those ideas, I am poor guy, and what can I do? I am alone. I hope through these, I built some fans in Garabol. They have a good number of followers who believe in the argument, but on the architectural level, not yet on the sustainable level. So maybe somebody pick up the ideas, I will die, others continue with it, much faster, much brighter. I'm sure there is some other people who continue with it. But we have to get out of this paradigm. That's my answer.
Thank you very much for these 3 days.